Hi guys, I'm Gasha. Welcome to the channel and welcome as always to our coffee times to discuss books in horror. And today I thought I would sit down and talk to you guys about the different subgenres of horror.
It's coffee time.
So I've always wanted to dive a little bit deeper into horror and the subgenres of horror, the different types of horror. I know a lot of people that are here on my channel don't always read horror, or are people that are looking for recommendations because they want to get introduced to horror books. Maybe some of them have tried one or two horror books and would like to keep trying some horror, but there are so many options that some people might feel a little bit overwhelmed, and I totally get that. Now this video is going to be a video about the types of horror fiction that we have, like about the subgenres of horror. And I'm gonna give you like a little introduction to the different types of subgenres. There are probably more out there. It's also really hard to differentiate them, but let's get into it. Dividing the horror genre into different subgenres is a lot more complicated than you might think. It is because there is so much overlap and so many crossovers that it is hard sometimes to decide what specific subgenre a book belongs to. And apart from that, we also have the books that actually are really hard to categorize because they're kind of opening a path for themselves. They're something completely unique and different. So those are also really hard to kind of classify into the different subgenres of horror. Let's also take, for example, zombies. Is this like a category by itself, you know, zombies, because there is so much out there about zombies? Or do we include them in the supernatural kind, like with werewolves and vampires, because they're kind of undead? So it's really hard to kind of draw the line between all of these different subgenres. So because I want to keep it as simple as possible, I have decided to break this down into 13 different categories that we're gonna take a look into. Horror novels, you know, the horror genre dates back to the 1800s, but since then so many things have happened. I feel like also in the recent years the horror genre in general, not just in literature but also in movies and TV shows, has evolved so much, and the definition of horror is no longer kind of like in a box. We've expanded and we've realized that there is so many different things that could be horror, even like simple things about everyday's life. And I'm really happy to be living in the present where there is so much new and kind of diverse horror coming our way. Now let's go to the different categories, and they are in absolute no particular order. So first we have comedy horror, which is a genre that is a little bit complicated because I think it requires a very specific type of reader, and also humor can be so different. And not everybody is gonna find the same books funny. So for me, comedy horror is always a hit or a miss. But basically this subgenre is trying to give you some fright and at the same time is delivering here and there some funny lines, some funny moments to kind of relieve the reader a little bit from all the horror tension. I feel like most people might be more familiar with comedy horror in movies than in books because there's been many successful movies like Shaun of the Dead. We had Ready or Not, which was amazing. We had Zombieland, which was also a lot of fun. And recently we got a horror comedy from the studio A24 called Bodies, Bodies, Bodies that I thought was fantastic, but it was kind of like a satiric horror, so it has to be something for you. So I feel like this specific subgenre might not be for everybody. I have a list of a couple of books that you might want to try here, so let me read them for you. We have John Dies at the End by David Wong. We have Hold Me Closer, Necromancer by Lish McBride. We have The Zombie Survival Guide by Max Brooks. We have My Life as a White Trash Zombie by Deanna Rowland. And we also have, for example, Gil's All Fried Dinner by A. Lee Martinez. So there is a lot of horror comedy out there if you guys are interested. Moving on to the next subgenre, we have one that I'm attracted to, but I always find hard to find books that fit into this subgenre, and that is dark fantasy. I feel like most fantasies might have some darkness to them, but they are not fully horror. However, I do enjoy a dark fantasy. I feel like you could even say that A Song of Ice and Fire is dark. I wouldn't consider it horror, but it is quite dark. In this type of subgenre, you might have your typical elements of a fantasy book. You might have maybe a different world, some creatures, some magic, but on top of that, you have some horror layer on it. I feel like Neil Gaiman is also a good example of someone that combines fantasy and horror. Now, his books are also very particular. I feel like his type of writing and his type of stories are not for everybody, but I do enjoy his books. I remember also reading Not Even Bones, and this is a YA dark fantasy, and I thought it had a lot of horror in it, a lot more than I anticipated. It is a trilogy, so it is a good one if you want to give it a chance. Other books that might fit this category are The Citadel of Fear by Gertrude Burroughs. We have The Black Company by Glenn Cook and Daughter of the Blood by Anne Bishop. Now let's go to a subgenre of horror that has been with us since the 1700s, 1800s. That's when the first novels would come out, that were Gothic. So Gothic is a little bit of a broader term, but I feel like Gothic represents a very specific set of atmosphere, and it comes with specific tropes as well. Most of these subgenres come with specific tropes or things that you would always see in this type of categories. Early writers like E.T.A. Hoffman or Mary Shelley really did start and pave the path for a lot of other writers that came after them. I am still completely obsessed with Mary Shelley's story and how she wrote Frankenstein at such a young age. Like, I am still like in shock by it. So these earlier Gothic novels, I feel like they combined horror with romance a little bit, and they had a very specific type of atmosphere. These were like deeper, more complex stories and relationships, but they also always involved some death. And now let me give you some examples of books that you could try if you're willing to dive into the Gothic subgenre of horror. So you could try, obviously, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. You could try The Devil's Elixirs by E.T.A. Hoffman. You could try The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, who is another writer that really did a lot for the Gothic subgenre. You have The Woman in Black by Susan Hill, another good like classic, and you have The Silent Companions by Laura Purcell. Moving on to a category that I feel like also is a little bit targeted to a more specific audience, and that would be Lovecraftian or cosmic horror. I do enjoy myself these subgenres, especially in movies, because I feel like I can visualize things so much better. In books, sometimes I get overwhelmed when the cosmic horror is really intense, but this is a really interesting subgenre that offers a lot of different options as well. What I love about this is that the cosmic horror comes from the concept of the universe being so vast, so huge, so big, we don't even really know what's out there. We feel like the world is just Earth, and there is just so much more, so much unknown, unexplored, and I love that, which is something that you could also relate with sci-fi horror in a way. And this is something that, of course, H.P. Lovecraft and people that came after him have been trying to explore. Lovecraft didn't consider himself a horror writer. He said he wrote weird fiction, which I get because, you know, cosmic horror is weird, and like I said, not everybody's taste. But this subgenre focuses on the fear of the unknown and the insignificance of humanity, and I think those are great topics to explore. Some of the books that you can check in this subgenre are At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. You have Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grimscribe by Thomas Ligotti, and The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Laval. Our next category is paranormal, and this one is a bit of a term that is being used a little bit more loosely, and it's a little bit harder to define. These normally are novels that tend to overlap or cross over with other subgenres easily. So let's just define the word paranormal, which literally means something that cannot be scientifically explained. So that is basically what it means, what the term means. So this can be anything from witchcraft to telekinesis to demon possession. But if you apply the term paranormal to horror books, normally these are books that contain ghosts, hauntings, and like haunted places. Those are the kind of things that you would see labeled under paranormal. You can even stretch it to demon possessions and demon encounters. And the horror comes because these are things that we can neither most of the time touch, explain, or not everybody can see. Maybe only our main protagonist can see it. And so these are things that are quite frightening. We always fear the unknown, the things that we cannot touch and kind of find a scientific explanation for. And now let me give you some recommendations for this subgenre. We have, of course, The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. We have The Family Plot by Cherry Priest. The Shining by Stephen King. A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. The Haunted of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. And those are just some examples. Coffee break. The next one is a subgenre that I know at some point was exploited to the point where people didn't want to hear more about it, but I'm still a sucker for this subgenre of horror, and that is post-apocalyptic stories. I just keep watching movies, I just keep reading books. Everything in post-apocalyptic I'm interested in because it's such a scenario that it seems so far-fetched, but at the end of the day, it's something that could happen anytime. So I just love to see the different interpretations of end of the world scenarios. Currently, we just started watching The Last of Us in HBO, and I just always loved the game and I love the story. So these are basically stories that talk about doomsday, end of the world, something that almost wipes out the whole humankind from Earth, and there are only a few survivors in probably really poor conditions to survive. This can be, a zombie apocalypse, but it can be also a virus that spreads, I don't know, through planes, through the air. It could be absolutely anything. It could be a comet that comes from the sky and wipes out half of the world. Like, it could be anything. And this is also why most of the post-apocalyptic stories fall also into the dystopia subgenre, because it is a new civilization that starts to emerge after an apocalypse. And like I said, it could be absolutely anything from zombies to a plague, and I just love to see the aftermath and how civilization is able to move forward and how they organize themselves, how they survive in the conditions that they're left with. And I just really enjoy this subgenre. But not every story that is a post-apocalyptic story or that deals with a possible end of humanity, they don't all have to be as extreme as zombies. I remember when I watched Interstellar, it's basically a film about the possible end of humankind and the human race. And it was so powerful. It was such a powerful message, and I really enjoyed that film, even though it was more sci-fi than horror. And there is a book that I read that it's not exactly 100% realistic, but it's a little bit closer to home, and that is Tender is the Flesh. I feel like something similar could potentially happen. So that one was one of my favorite things that I read when it comes to that, to the end of civilization as we know it right now. Other book recommendations I can give you are Swan Song by Robert McCammon, Monument 14 by Emmy Laybourne, Feet by Mira Grant, The Road by Colin McCarthy, I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, and The Passage by Justin Cronin. The next category, subgenre of horror, is very popular, and that is psychological horror. And I feel like this one is really popular because when somebody's trying to play with your mind, it is something that it's just so effective because it immediately creates this tension and this curiosity for the reader to keep trying to figure out what's going on in the book. In these stories, mostly the horror, the terror is happening in our minds or our characters' minds. So it's always also hard to know if they are sane, if they have lost their minds, who is right and who is wrong in this type of stories. These are stories where the writer does not spoon feed you all the information, so it is the reader that kind of has to figure out, and kind of we have to use our minds to clarify what's going on and try to guess. Is that little kind of hint of eyes of a monster hiding in the closet where you don't quite see everything, but you know that something's there? It's not the story of a slasher and a killer that just comes in, home invasion, kills everybody. It's something so subtle. It's something that you kind of have to be aware of everything that's going on, you know, the creaking of the door, a window that is left open. It's all of these little details, and I feel like that's why we as readers really love this type of subgenre of horror, because it is a lot more engaging for us. You start to get suspicious, you start to try to figure out the pieces of the puzzle, how to put everything together, and that is always a lot of fun. And it's a horror that feels really real, because it's not just a monster or a ghost, which are concepts that we find a bit more unrealistic. It's basically something that is related to us humans, something that could happen to us, and it is so relatable, and that is why it's really scary. Some of the books that I can recommend you for this subgenre are Rosemary's Baby by Year 11, Come Closer by Sarah Gran, Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, and All That We Remember by Eleanor Gill. And now we're going to one of my favorite subgenres of horror. I know that this is not a very unique and creative subgenre of horror, but honestly, I just love it, and that is psychos, killers, and slashers. I just love them. What can I do? We have, you know, maniacs, serial killers. You can even put here cannibals. We have the psychos. We have here everybody that just a lot of times just goes on a rampage or a killing spree and leaves a lot of dead bodies behind. They tend to be bloody, they tend to be in your face, and I just have a lot of fun with this subgenre. It's basically about human monsters. It is humans that turn into monsters. And this subgenre of horror has also been around for a really, really long time. You know, if you go back all the way to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, all of those movies already were defining a little bit this subgenre. This specific subgenre of horror kind of tends to merge with the psychological horror, especially if you think of books and movies, you know, like American Psycho, where we have someone that is a killer, but also there is a really heavy psychological horror aspect to it. And these are things that can merge really well together. And in these type of novels, it's not monsters and ghosts and vampires that we fear. It's actually humans. It is our own kind. And that is also why these also tends to be a little bit more relatable. The news are horrifying. If you would check news of the world every day, everywhere, there's people being killed, there is serial killers still like being caught. It's just crazy. People that disappear, they don't know what happened to them. All of those kind of true crime stories remind us of the real monsters in this world, and that is us humans. So some of the books that I would recommend you here is Psycho by Robert Bloch, the already mentioned American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, and please keep in mind that this one is very brutal, so you know, just check your trigger warnings before going into this one. We have The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, again, so you can see some of these books can enter different categories. We have Off Season by Jack Ketchum, Final Girls by Riley Sager, and you could even add Endless Night by Richard Lehman. There are just so many options here. Moving to a completely different subgenre of horror, and that is sci-fi horror. I feel like this is also a subgenre that doesn't get too much love. I don't feel like there is so many books coming out every year that are sci-fi horror, and we need a little bit more of it. These stories combine sci-fi elements like, you know, futuristic societies and like time travel or like spaceships. And they combine it with more, let's say, common elements of horror, like creatures and aliens that can enter also other subgenres of horror. I I feel like even though sci-fi horror is popular, we see that more in movies. We had Invisible Man, we had Underwater, and other movies that have come out in the last years that are sci-fi horror. I feel when it comes to novels, as I've mentioned before, there is not so much coming out, and that is just a pity. But I feel like this subgenre is really interesting because we are talking here about worlds that have never been explored and possible civilizations that we never heard about before. So the possibilities are endless, and also it is terrifying, especially if you're in a situation where you're isolated or left stranded in another, you know, in another futuristic society or in another planet. So the possibilities are endless. Some of the books that I can recommend you are Blindside by Peter Watts, Contagion by Erin Bowman. This is YA. We have Night Flyers by George R.R. Martin. This is very short, so if you're looking for something quick. We have Infected by Scott Sigler. We have Carrion Comfort by Dan Simmons, and The Luminous Dead by Kathleen Starling that I read last year and absolutely loved it. And now let's talk about another subgenre of horror that is really difficult to define and to separate from other subgenres, and that is supernatural, because this one again merges with other ones, tends to overlap. The definition of supernatural is something that appears to transcend the laws of nature, which is kind of like a broad definition. It's not very specific, and it is a subgenre that is easily confused and compared and sometimes even interchangeable with the paranormal subgenre. So in order to make it easier for you to differentiate them, I would tell you that paranormal is when we are talking about demonic possessions, ghosts, and hauntings. And we could say supernatural would be more the category that includes the zombies, the vampires, the werewolves, and all of those supernatural creatures. And there are so many novels that fit in the supernatural subgenre. So I'm just gonna give you a couple of examples, like My Soul to Keep by Tanavir Due, Dracula, obviously, by Bram Stoker, one of my favorites, Salem's Lot by Stephen King, another favorite of mine. We have The Woven by Whitley Strieber, and obviously the classic and lovely Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. Now it's time to explore our next subgenre of horror, and that is monsters slash creatures. And this is obviously something that could be also merged a little bit into the supernatural, because monsters and creatures can be zombies, can be werewolves, and can be vampires, but it can be also all complete of different things. There are so many creature feature movies and also a lot of books about different types of creatures. It's not always werewolves, it's not always vampires. There's so much more out there, things that are unexplainable. You can even find books about Bigfoot, other things, you know, the chupacabra, whatever it is, you can all fit that into this category. There's also a lot of novels about sea monsters. You could even take killing mermaids as some monsters as well. It is very interesting because this subgenre also offers the possibility of creating such unique creatures, because all bets are off. You can do whatever you want with your creature. And this can be a really frightening subgenre of horror because, again, fear of the unknown. We don't know what kind of creature this is. We don't know how they kill. We don't know how to kill them. We don't know how to survive. We don't know what they're gonna do to us. So it is always the fear of the unknown, and most of these creatures also tend to be lethal. They tend to be big and they look sometimes disgusting. They have big teeth, and yeah, these are a lot of fun to read actually. A couple of books that you could try are The Drowning Deep by Mira Grant, like I said, Killing Mermaids, The Forgotten Island by David Sodergran, and Creature by Handa Shih. Our next category is a subgenre of horror that I'm also aware it is not for every type of reader, because this is body horror. And we could even say body horror or torture porn. They're not always the same, but the concept is similar. It's just a lot of horror that goes into detail of how bodies are mutilated or how bodies decompose, are affected by creature virus infections, and everything is just explained to the detail where you almost want to throw up. Even in 1915, Frank Kafka already wrote The Metamorphosis, which is about a man that wakes up one day and starts to turn into a giant bug. So this could also be one of the first kind of body horror books out there. So body horror could be that, you know, like the story from the movie The Fly, which I love that movie so much, in which a human basically goes through a transformation, and that tends to be really disgusting for us because we can totally feel it in our bones because we are human and our main, you know, protagonist is a human that is turning into a giant bug or something like that. But body horror can also be taken to the gore section of things, where it could be just a serial killer that the way they execute their victims is quite extreme. I feel like there is a movie that I can explain this better with, which is Terrifier 2. It is a very gory body horror film, so if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. And those stories sometimes don't have a heavy plot. It's mostly about the horror of the kill, the mutilation of the bodies. So sometimes people can say, okay, it is torture porn, which torture porn is when you are getting depicted scenes of death and mutilation without any purpose apart from grossing out the audience and causing that kind of disgusting reaction. So here are some examples. So obviously I'm gonna mention here Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke by Eric LaRocca, because he's been a new author coming into the horror genre that has given us such amazing and beautiful body horror. We have The Troop by Nick Cutter, most of Junji Ito, and I would say also Wife by Samantha Kolesnik is another one. Now these ones tend to be quite extreme, so you know, I mean, if you hear the word gore, body horror, torture porn, you kind of know what you're getting yourself into. But for some of these books, I would really check the trigger warnings. And last but not least is another one of my favorite subgenres of horror, and also one of the ones that are quite terrifying because it is something so real that could happen to anybody, and that is home invasion. These ones tend to be sometimes also overlapping with serial killers, slashers, stuff like that. But home invasion is a subgenre of its own, and I really do enjoy it. The premise of home invasion, it just means basically that you're in your own home, you feel like you're in your safe space, and then somebody or something enters your home and what they want is basically to harm you. And of course this is really terrifying because it plays on your mind, you know, on the fear of being home alone, on the fear of strangers just coming into your house. They might just want to steal something, but they might want to kill you. You could even say that a home invasion could be also by a ghost that appears, or a demon that has been summoned or appears suddenly in your house, but I would leave that to other subgenres of horror, and I would consider home invasions more something that humans tend to do, so I would consider this one more of a human home invasion. Now this subgenre of horror is trying to make you feel unsafe, and it can be also that people don't break into a house per se, but another building establishment, and they decide to just invade it and kill the people inside of it. It is a very interesting subgenre, and I think there are a lot of movies out there that people feel uncomfortable with because of it, like Funny Games or The Strangers. So there are not too many home invasion books that I have read, so I would recommend you here again Endless Night by Richard Lehman, because it does start with a home invasion story, but then it kind of morphs into more of a slasher. But another one that I read that is really interesting, and it was really different from other books that I have read, is Anybody Home by Michael J. Seidlinger, that gives us a more of a perspective on the people that are breaking into homes. So it's not from the victim's perspective, but from the perpetrator's perspective. And I thought that was quite interesting. Alright guys, so these were the 13 subgenres of horror that I wanted to talk to you today about. I really hope that you enjoyed this video because I was really excited to tell you about the different subgenres of horror, and I've been thinking that maybe I will do a series of these videos in which I will go into detail for every single one of these subgenres, give you more recommendations depending on the subgenre, and try to find more information about the different subgenres that I have mentioned here, so you have a deeper guide into horror. Let me know if you would be interested in that. Thank you guys as always so much for watching, and I hope to see you all as always in our next coffee time. Bye!